Welcome to a tutorial video on PHP. In this video I'm going to talk about objects. We've been building in complexity across these 4 videos. The first video we talked about variables, how we can store different values in them. The second one we talked about arrays, which was a collection of values, a little more complicated than the variables before that. After that was functions, which we used to deal with variables and different things, ways to break up projects. In this video, we're going to talk about objects, which combines variables and functions as a more abstract data structure. So, PHP supports many different programming paradigms. These are ways of solving problems, ways of thinking about programming. One of the major ones is object-oriented programming. It is sometimes called a paradigm because it is a way of thinking. So PHP supports this through allowing us to create different objects. However, object-oriented programming has its own terminology and ways of thinking about things. In object-oriented programming, in this model, we think of large projects, things we're thinking of, solutions we're trying to come up with, as a series of objects and their relationships to each other. Objects either have a is-a or a has-a relationship to one another. So an object either is another type of object or an object has a other type of thing. We also think of objects having attributes or properties depending on the terminology and whatever background you might be coming from. These are things that describe that object. So we might, for example, think of a giraffe as having legs and having a long neck and having a body. These are ways of describing a giraffe. So we have attributes or properties, ways of describing an object. We also have functions or methods, depending on the terminology, that describe the relationship between one object and another. So we have attributes and properties that describe that object. Then we have methods, or sometimes called functions, depending on the programming background, to describe the relationship between these objects. So we can describe the objects, and then we have things that describe the relationship between these objects. And the relationships we describe between objects are either so an object is something else, or has something else. This is a little confusing, but I think it'll help once we walk through these. So there's one other thing to keep track of when we're dealing with object-oriented programming, and that is it is built in a private or public model. That is, data, variables, or functions or methods are either public, that is, they are available outside the object, or they are private, that is, they are only accessible inside the object. This is important because it allows an object to keep certain data private that it's working with, for example, maybe a password or something important like that, and also have a public-facing thing. So functions or methods are usually public-facing. So you say, hey, I want this value, and then you send it something. Like, hey, in the case of a website, maybe you send it your password, and it sends you back a way to log in, something like that. So we can think of these different models of public and private, as well as I said, attributes or properties of an object, and functions or methods of an object, and how they relate to each other. This is a lot of different terminology, but I'll walk through all of this. So when we're defining an object within PHP, we use the keyword class. This is a class or a blueprint for an object. So it doesn't exist yet, but this is what it will look like when we create a new one. So we're using the keyword class, followed by the name of this object. The naming convention follows the same as variables and functions in PHP. That is, it can contain numbers, letters, underscores, but no other special characters or spaces. So letters, numbers, and the underscore basically. It is defined similar to a function in that it's defined through opening and closing curly brackets around its entire body. So we have the class keyword, the name of this object, and then opening and closing curly brackets around everything that's within this object. So everything in here is inside this object. In this example, we start here with 2 private variables. We know they're private because the keyword private is used. By default, if variables are created inside an object, they are public. by default. So if we don't want them to be public, we use the private keyword, which makes them only accessible inside that object. So we have two private variables. We see the keyword private, and we see variables here, name. We know it's a variable. It has a $sign. So we're setting this to default and setting ID to 1234. Again, these are private variables, and we know they're private because the private keyword is being used here. I'm going to jump down a bit and come back to this. So down here on line 11 and 13, and then 15 through 17, we see we are defining two different functions. These are public functions, and we know they're public because the keyword private is not being used here. Again, if we want something to be private inside an object, we use the private keyword. By default, it's going to be public. These are two public functions, which means they can be used outside the object to do something with it. So, if we want to refer to data inside an object that it contains, we use a special keyword called this. The this keyword is a variable referring to the object inside which something is. So, right here we have a $sign. This is a variable, the keyword this, and it's pointing to, notice the minus sign and the greater than sign pointing to something inside itself. So this object pointing to something. In this case, it is this pointing to name. Name, we know up here, is a private variable. So it's saying, in this object, go find something called name and get its value, because we know it's a variable. We know it's a variable because it starts with a $sign. So right here we say, hey, in this thing I am, go find this thing called name and get me this value. And in the case of line 12, we're then returning that value. So why are we returning this value? Because it's private and it otherwise can't be accessed. So we have public-facing functions that act as a gatekeeper to the private data. And this is actually a pretty good structure for thinking about objects. Objects have their internal things. We have ways of getting to them, usually public functions to private data. So we're using this keyword pointing to something. In this case, pointing to name, which is a private variable. And that's lines 12 and line 16. We're getting the name and getting the ID. And again, as I review, as I talked about in the video on functions, we're naming these functions get name and get ID as a helpful way to remind people what these functions do. We could name them whatever we want. PHP has no rules on that. But it's helpful and recommended to name functions about what they do. So we're getting the name, getting the ID. These are the names of these functions. So let's roll back a little bit to lines 6 through 9. This is where things get a little bit different, but not totally different. So when PHP was first created, it wasn't exactly an object-oriented programming. You could do parts of it, sort of, but it wasn't aimed at that. It didn't include all that functionality. In later editions, they added that functionality, and one of the things they added was a way to create a constructor. This is another term that has to do with object-oriented programming. A constructor is a thing that constructs. It's a very useful name. So when we're creating a new object based on the blueprint we define, that is, we're creating a new object based on this blueprint, it is through a process called construction. So we need something called a constructor that allows us to send data into that object to initialize its values. This is called a constructor. It's a special type of function. So it's a function, so we can send data in, get data out, or send data in and do something. And it's special named in PHP. And it's named __ construct. This is a special name. If we want a constructor as part of our object, we have to call it this. So __ construct. This acts as a constructor and allows us to make a new object based on our blueprint here. So because it's a function, we can send data into it. In this case, its arguments or its parameters, depending on the terminology you may be used to, we're sending two things in. The first data we're sending in is going to be called the variable name. The second data is going to be called the variable ID. So we're sending data into this object by sending data to its constructor function that acts as a normal function. Lines 7 and 8, we're setting the internal name using this again. So this object, again, we know it's a variable because it has a $sign. Setting to the value of this variable, we know it's a variable because it has a $sign, of name. So we're setting hey. Set the internal name and the internal ID to these two values I'm giving you. So you're saying, hey function, here's name and here's ID. Go ahead and set the internal name and the internal ID to these two things. So this is a very helpful way to send in an initial data, to initialize or construct an object based on existing data. We say, hey function, or hey constructor in this case, send it data and build the object based on this data, working through the blueprint that we've defined as part of this class. Remember, class is a blueprint for an object. It doesn't exist yet. We're just defining how it looks and how it works. So, this object starts with a keyword class, has a name, has a body, through the curly brackets right here, top to bottom, has two private variables, has three functions, a constructor and two other functions. And again, we use a constructor to create a new object. So let's do that. Moving down here on line 21, we have a new variable, demo person. We know it's a variable because it has a $sign in front of it. And we now are using the new keyword. The new keyword tells PHP to create a new object based on a blueprint. So we say, hey, create a new object. This is the new keyword. The object I want you to create, or the blueprint I want you to follow, is probably a better way to put that, is person. Send in, that is, send this data to the constructor, these two things. We're sending in John, and we're sending in 5678. We know at the top, this will become the name, and this will become the ID. So we're saying, hey, to the constructor, send John, send 5678, create a new object based on the blueprint of the object we're creating as a person, we're sending in this data. So, okay, we have a brand new data called based on the blueprint of person with the value John 5678. That entire object, that entire value is in the variable demo person. So because it's an object, it can do the same things we could do inside the object. That is, it can point to things. In this case, line 23, we're saying, okay, for the object that is the value of the variable demo person pointing to the function getName. So call getName, hey function, and return this name. This name is whatever name is inside this data. During the constructor, whatever name was sent into it was what it was given. So that becomes its name. So if we call this, we get back John. And in fact, I'll run this. So we see right here, John. This is line 23. So we say, okay, hey function, get back the name. The name is the internal data of the object. The internal data of the object was set through the constructor. So this is a more abstract and complex way to think about data. But we're using the same concepts we've been using across these videos. Variables and functions. We're just adding in some new terminology as a way to describe these relationships. So I mentioned at the very top, objects exist in two different relationships to each other, is a and has a. So usually objects have things, so it has a. So in this case, it has two variables. This is a has a relationship. It has a variable, has a value. It can also exist in a is a relationship. One object is another. Objects are other objects through functionality called inheritance. This is a way to better organize objects, where we have a base object, something generic like a person, and then we can have a type of person that extends that functionality in some way. So we have a person, then we have maybe a programmer. A programmer is like a person, that is, it is a person, but it has something special about it. But it also has everything a person has. So it is a person, but it also does a little bit different, does something slightly different. So we do that in PHP by using the keyword extends and then the name of an object. This allows us to extend that functionality. So we can define a base object that does something, then we can extend it by creating another object that uses all of that base functionality but also adds its own. This is similar to how we were thinking about functions in a previous video as a chain of actions that will allow us to break up something into smaller things. In object-oriented programming, we can think about objects in the same way. We can have a base object and then other objects that extend off that object and allow us to think about these relationships. So a person and then a programmer. Well, a programmer is a person, but a programmer does things slightly different than what we might think of as a normal person. So we see that right here. A new object. Keyword class, the name of the object, a programmer, keyword extends, and the name of another object, person. So a programmer is a person. This is the is a relationship, but it also extends person. So we can do everything a person can do, plus some new things. We see it also has private variable skill. It also down here has a functions, lines 36 through 38, called getSkill, again named something useful, but we could name it whatever we wanted. And it returns internal data, which we know is a variable because it has the $sign. So it returns skill, which is a private variable as part of this blueprint for this object. So let's look at its constructor. Again, as I mentioned earlier in this video, it's a constructor, so it uses a special function name underscore construct. In this case, we're sending in three different things: the name, the ID, and the skill. Three things. So just previous to what we're using in person, this skill is equal to the value skill. Both are variables. So we say, hey, for this internal thing, send it to whatever value I just got for skill. Then we're doing something a little different. So because programmer inherited from person, person is the parent of programmer. So we can think of that in a way of a family, right? We have children and we have parents. And the children inherit from the parents. Sometimes that's genetic, sometimes it's money, sometimes it's things. In the case of programming, in this metaphor, it inherits all of the functionality of whatever its parent is. Remember, I said it is a relationship. So a programmer is a person. It has everything a person has. So we say parent, colon, and then call its constructor. Its constructor, we know in PHP, is named a special function, underscore construct. So parent, colon, construct. So we say, hey, call the parent with this data. So it calls the parent constructor, which will scroll up at the top, and it does everything the parent constructor does. So its internal data is set to name and set to ID, the same as this. Because a programmer is a person, then it does the same thing. So it has a name, it has an ID, the programmer added a skill. So let's come all the way down here, and we see that, okay, skill is set to this, name and ID, because it also has those, are set through the parent constructor. So notice how programmer is significantly shorter than all of the code that made up person. This allows us to, as I said, create smaller objects that extend other base or more generic objects, breaking up tasks and thinking through their relationships. Finally, at the very bottom here, we're actually using this new object. We're using classes, which is a blueprint of an object, so we're creating a new one. We see this on line 42. We have a new variable. We know it's a variable because it has a $sign. Using the new keyword, so hey, create a new object based on this blueprint. What blueprint? Well, the programmer blueprint. Then we're sending in three things. Sending in name, Jordan, ID, 8989, and skill, knows PHP. Then, just like we've done before, if we want to get something out of that object, a reference, a variable, assuming it's public, or a function, assuming it's public, we can do so by pointing, say, hey, this object and this thing. So we say, okay, in the object that is the value of the variable demo programmer, pointing at something. In this case, point at the function getName. So we want to get the name. Line 45, the same thing, but now getSkill. Which if we run this, we see that. After John, we see Jordan, which is the getName. So we're getting the name, which was set because we sent Jordan into the constructor of programmer. The constructor of programmer called the constructor of person, which set that name. Then we set the ID the same way. Finally, we said getSkill. GetSkill is over here as knows PHP, which was the third thing we set in, which was set right here on line 31. So let's review all of this. In programming terminology, object-oriented programming is a way of describing different objects and their relationship to each other. The two primary ways of categorizing these relationships, the two main relationships, are is a or has a. Is a is a way of describing one object that is like another object. It is another object. This is through something called inheritance in object-oriented programming, that it is one object that extends another. And we use that in PHP by using the extends keyword. So this object extends an existing object. It builds on top of it, but it also is a other object. So a programmer is a person. Programmers are people. The other relationship is a has a relationship. So objects have things. And as we discussed, they can have variables. These are ways of describing itself, or data that is internal if it's private. It also has functions, or sometimes called methods in other programming languages. Ways of relating to other things, or ways of accessing its data. One of the ways we talked about is having private data using the private keyword, and having public functions that act as gatekeepers to that data, which is a good model to think about. So we have public functions that we use to get to the private data or do something with the private data. And we also talked about the two different ways of describing data and functions, either as default, public, or if we're using the private keyword, private, which means we can only access them inside the object. The other sort of wrinkle to using public and private is that when an object extends another, it can also use those private functions because it is that other object. So this is a way to describe relationships to each other, public and private. Things we can get at are public, things that are private we can't get at externally. Objects also have inheritance, that is, they build off of each other, they extend each other using the extends keyword. And we create new objects based on the blueprints that we use using the keyword class. We create a model of something we want to look at, use the new keyword to create that object. We tell it what object. In these two cases, person or programmer. We send data in. The data we send in, saying, hey function, is part of a constructor that constructs the new object based on that data. This is all a very complex way of describing object-oriented programming in PHP. But it's not too terribly different, as I mentioned at the top, from the variables, the arrays, and the functions. Objects just combine all of these together and use them as part of a system to describe the world through objects, which is one of a different number of paradigms, ways of thinking, that describe possible solutions to problems through methods or methodologies of describing those problems in different ways to solve them. In this case, through objects. Thanks for watching.